Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's talk a bit more now about the top story today, rail ticket price hikes. The biggest fare increase in 5 years has come into force today. Joining us to talk about it from central London is James Price, the campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. James, good to speak to you.
Happy New Year.
Very happy New Year to you as well. So a 3.4% increase, outstripping wages. It's getting tough for people, isn't it?
It does sound like quite a high increase, but really this, as with all other things, is really about who pays and who pays for the services they receive. People who are rail commuters in Britain tend to be better paid and better well off than the average. They're often commuting from nice bits of the country into big cities, and the way that pricing of tickets in the UK is worked out that people who use that service pay a bit more of it. That's why it looks on the continent like tickets in Germany and France are much cheaper, because taxpayer subsidy there is much higher. Why is it fair that people who get the bus or drive to work themselves, that's most people in the country, should help subsidise more wealthy commuters?
You know, franchises owned by foreign companies, Southern, for example, owned by French owners, everything like that suggests that maybe if nationalisation isn't the answer to the railways, something does need to change, because we're not getting a fair amount out of what we put in, if you are a rail user, like you said.
Well, no, but this kind of subsidy that goes to these companies is only something like 13 pence per journey. That's far and away from the high amount. So it's not exactly that these companies are creaming massive profits. That's not where the ticket fares are really going. A lot of it is going into redeveloping the infrastructure. Because of the long, dark days of nationalisation, there was a lot of underinvestment. That's why various lines were being closed back in the past. And so there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done. You're seeing today London Bridge is opening up again. And of course, there is more work that needs to be done, and we could finance infrastructure there better by scrapping something as bad as HS2. But a lot of the money goes on staffing costs, and you see that as well with the fact that Southern Rail drivers are getting a 28% pay increase after lots and lots of strikes saying it was about safety, not pay. They then suddenly settled for wages of something like 70 grand a year to drive a train. So there are lots of costs coming from union action like that. It's not really that these privatised companies are creaming off huge amounts.
So what does the future hold? Are rail fares, season tickets, going to continue getting higher because the cost of regeneration and infrastructure projects will get more expensive? Or could we expect them to be frozen at some point in the next couple of years, or even go down? Because what people are saying today, certainly defending this price hike, is that it's all about reinvestment into stations, lines, trains that will become to be beneficial in the next couple of years.
Yeah, we might see if this investment actually pans out well and people start to see and feel the benefits of it, then people might be more okay with the increased prices. The politics, of course, is very different to the actual policy in it, and if the government realises it might be a big vote loser, they might announce freezes and things like that. But of course that money comes from somewhere, and that money will be coming largely from taxpayers. The other things to do about it are a lot more structural. Why have we got people who have to do very long commutes and journeys in? It's because we're not building enough houses where people want there to be. Central London is a lot less dense than New York or Paris or Tokyo or any of these other big capital cities. If we could build more houses near to where people actually need to work in big cities, there's one easy way there. People won't have to have such long journeys. It's other structural things like that that will help keep these costs down.
Do you think it's palatable to rail travellers that they are getting such a price hike at the same time as the Transport Secretary is bailing out Stagecoach and Virgin Trains, who aren't going to be pumping money back into the taxpayers' pockets through that East Coast main line?
Well, I mean, I'm a rail commuter myself, so I feel the frustration of everybody. You don't like seeing these delays, and you don't like seeing various bailouts here, there, and everywhere. But if you look overall, passenger satisfaction is actually very high. It's something like 83% of people tend to be happy with it. It's obviously easy to make hay when you hear delays, and we're back on our first day back after the new year, and you start hearing about delays and things are very busy and all this sort of thing. But one of the reasons, by the way, for trains being very busy is because there's lots of demand. More than twice as many people now are using using the rails as they were in those dark old days of nationalisation. And that kind of demand is part of the reason why the trains are so busy. So we could do more things like increase the signalling and redeveloping the signalling on the network, extending platforms and carriages so that you could have longer trains. Those are the things to focus on rather than worrying about these sorts of bailouts in other areas. There's a lot more things the government could be doing rather than just increasing the costs of general to taxpayers.
OK, James Price, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Joining us from central London is Stephen Joseph, Chief Executive of Campaign for Better Transport. Stephen, good to speak to you. Just want to put a few things that we heard from the Taxpayers Alliance in the last hour to you. They claim that people hit by this hike generally are wealthier people commuting into London, and they can afford a hike in the price.
Well, that's a kind of vicious circle, isn't it? The more you hike up rail fares, the more the railways will only be for the rich. Actually, I've not heard the Taxpayers Alliance express concern about the impact of say, bus cuts on the poorer people in rural areas, or in general on people left isolated in their homes by the lack of any public transport at all. So I think the Taxpayers Alliance needs to be a bit less selective about what it goes for on transport policy and look at the broader failures of transport policy, which is leaving a lot of people facing very high proportions of their salaries going into travel costs, whether by road or rail, and making it much more difficult for people to get into work.
Customer satisfaction generally pretty high. Transport Focus saying satisfaction ranging between 72% and 97% for overall company satisfaction.
Yes, but if you look at the same Transport Focus figures, they show that value for money scores are lower. And although the railways are doing lots of things right, and we're a pro-rail group, we want to see more people using the trains, it's the government that's making it more difficult by adding to fares rises. We think that this year there should have been a freeze on rail fares, as there was a freeze on field duty. What's good for motorists should be good for rail passengers. They've seen endless increases in rail fares. We want to see the rail fares and the railways become simpler, fairer and cheaper to use, so that more people use them and less people use their cars, so you get less congestion and pollution.
Would you like to see the railways renationalised?
I think it would depend entirely what kind of renationalisation you get. If you get the kind of nationalisation that we had in the 60s and 70s, which was all about cuts and in lines and services, that would be bad. If you get the kind of nationalised railway we had in the 80s and 90s, which was very efficient and with more investment going in, that might be good. But the problem we've had is that we've got a fragmented railway with the government changing its policy every few months in some cases on whether it wants whether it wants electrification, whether it doesn't want electrification. We actually need a coherent long-term rail strategy, whether that's under public or private ownership. And there's evidence from around the world that both work. What we've got here doesn't work, and actually it's government policy that's impeding the use of the railways and the simplification of them.
Is it not the case that if there was some sort of renationalisation with investment, that it would just add exponentially to the net debt that Network Rail already has? £46.3 billion worth of net debt they're in at the moment. It wouldn't be acceptable to pile more on top of that, would it?
Well, the problem is this is entirely down to the way in which government balance sheets work. I don't think other countries work like this. They don't think, well, we've got to get the trains or the tracks off the government balance sheet because otherwise it'll be counted in the national debt. And that's what drives a lot of British transport policy, trying to get to satisfy statistical systems that aren't really fit for the real world. Or you need a much better system that promotes long-term investment and gives people real choice in how they get about. In lots of cases, people use cars or firms use trucks because there aren't decent alternatives available. We want to make sure that there are better alternatives available that are cheaper to use, so that people and goods can get around the country.
OK, Stephen Joseph from Campaign for Better Transport, thank you.
There's misery for commuters today after the biggest fare increases for 5 years came into force. Campaigners say many people are being priced out of getting to work, and Labour says it will make more people consider travelling by car. Let's take a closer look at some of the figures for you, should we? Many season tickets have gone up by more than £100. An annual pass from Prime Minister Theresa May's constituency of Maidenhead to London has risen by £104 to £3,092. The charity Campaign for Better Transport says the figures show that average season tickets into London have gone up by £146 this year, nearly double the £74 rise last January. Some commuters are now having to spend up to 5 times as much of their salary on season tickets as people on the continent. Chief Executive of Network Rail, Mark Khan, says the rail network is improving. I just have to take my word for that, because instead let's bring in from York Labour MP Rachel Maskell, who is also former Shadow Transport Minister. Hi, thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. So we've seen rail fares go up higher than inflation yet again. What are you putting it down to?
Well, this is the steepest rise that has been experienced, and therefore commuters turning up start of the year, they go to buy their ticket and find it's costing them at least 3.4% more, which obviously is having a huge impact on people's the amount of money they've got. And as we hear, it's a major part of people's salary now is just being able to fund going to work.
OK, so what should be done then? How can we make sure that rail fares do not go up by, on average, 3.4%? Are you suggesting that taxpayer subsidies should come into force?
Well, Labour have fully costed the programme to look at what we would do, and we certainly wouldn't put it up with the RPI figure of inflation which is being used at the moment. Using the CPI, the more realistic figure, putting that cap on fares will make such a difference to commuters, but also making sure that there's reinvestment back into the railway. We must remember that the government at the moment are bailing out these failed private companies at the same time as commuters are having to pay more. We would rebalance that by bringing rail back into public ownership, reinvesting that money back into the railways, which is all about passengers, not these private companies. We've got to put the focus back on the passenger, and that's what Labour's policy is all about.
Well, we find ourselves, the argument would go, redeveloping infrastructure now because of the lack of investment during nationalisation previously.
Well, the Tory government have been in place 7 years, and what we have seen is the switching on and off of infrastructure projects. We'd have a long-term plan to make sure that investment flowed into upgrading the lines as needed on the East Coast, or upgrading the railways. So we've got a very clear picture that we want to make sure there's a clear, steady plan moving forward, but also that passengers aren't footing the bill every single time there is a failure in the private sector and these companies which have fragmented our railway system. We want to bring it all together so it moves smoothly and seamlessly for the public.
With respect, my question was about previous nationalisation and the fact that there wasn't enough investment during that period, which is why infrastructure is having to be redeveloped now.
Sorry, I misheard you. The line's not clear. But what I would say about the programme we're putting forward for bringing rail back into public ownership, we're not going back, we're going forward. A new public sector deal for the railway, which is about the investment that is needed on the railways, and therefore we're taking out the private profit which is currently there, which obviously passengers are having to pay into, and therefore putting all the resources back into the service for passengers. That's what our rail system is about. It's about growing our economy, connecting our economy and connecting people.
So Labour would be happy for taxpayer subsidies from people who don't use the rail network, never use the rail network, prefer to travel by car or whatever else, but you feel that it's reasonable for them to also invest in the rail network?
Well, everybody gains from there being a rail network. We must remember that if you're taking more people off the road, but because there's a good functioning rail system, that obviously frees up space on the railways. So everybody will gain from Labour's policy around transport. And it's not just about rail, it's about the intermodal connectivity, making sure people have that seamless journey. Because when you plan your day, you don't think about just the stop-start between bus and then rail. You think about how you're going to get from your home to your end destination, and we want to make sure that that works for the public.
Well, is it not reasonable to also assume or to know that people who travel by rail, commuters, are better paid generally and are better well off than the average, and yet they will, under your plans, be subsidised by people who are not?
Well, what Labour wants to do is improve social mobility and therefore to enable access to the rail system, the service there, for people who currently can't afford it, as we hear these extortionate prices now being charged on the railways are costing so many people out. People this morning were telling me that it's just too much of their budget to continue on trains, and therefore what's really important is that we open up that access to everyone, seeing the main arteries of our transport system as being the railways, feeding off into the bus and local networks. So we really want to attract people onto the railways, not to exclude them, and therefore, again, as I said, everybody will benefit from Labour's policy on transport.
House building would alleviate some of those longer train journeys, and Labour not without guilt when it comes to not building enough properties.
Sorry, you're going to have to repeat that question.
Yes, I was making the point that house building would alleviate some of the longer train journeys, and the previous Labour government's not without guilt when it comes to building enough properties for people to live in, not only in inner cities, but in closer commuter areas.
Well, we're building, and as you'll see in our transport policies, we're putting a system together which is looking at intermodal transport, enabling people to go right across the network, putting the investment in good rolling stock, good infrastructure and a good passenger service. That's really at the heart of our transport policy, and we want to make sure that the public really gain from that. So we're moving forward. We're not going back into old systems. We're moving forward into a new era of the railway to invest in the next generation of commuters, but also people that use the railways for leisure.
One wonders why previous Labour governments didn't do that.
Well, I'm talking about now, and we've got a really strong team. Obviously, politics has changed massively. We've put our values at the heart of what we believe is important in politics, and we're taking the railways forward, as with the rest of our transport system, to make sure it works for the wider communities. That's what is at the heart of what Labour is about, making sure that services are there to serve the public, and in the future you'll see that from our rail policy, that it is really about the public's interest, and that's what Labour are going to be doing. OK, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Can and should the government do more to restrict rail fare rises? Bruce Williamson from the campaign group Rail Future, which campaigns for better rail services, is in Bristol, and Stephen Swinford, the deputy political editor of The Telegraph, is in our central London studio for us. Bruce, to you first of all, what could and should be done, if anything?
Well, it's very much in the hands of government. They set the rail fare rises every year, and they set the rail fare rises based on the higher measure of inflation, RPI, rather than the lower one. And if they chose CPI, which they claim is their preferred measure of inflation, then rail fares wouldn't have gone up by anywhere near as much as they have done.
Stephen, it's that straightforward.
You'd like to think it's that straightforward. Tory MPs are absolutely furious about this. I've been talking to a lot of them over the last day or so, and they were really worried about the rises before they came in, and they're concerned that this is precisely the kind of issue that a Conservative government should be looking at, helping hard-pressed commuters, and that not enough is being done. The government is actually reviewing and looking at whether it should move to CPI rather than RPI, but there is a big problem in that it would cost them quite a lot of money, and where you get that money from is a very difficult question in these slightly straitened times that we're in.
So, but it's not quite as straightforward as you suggest.
Well, these are undoubtedly straitened times, but there's a huge contrast to be made with fuel duty for motorists. We've had 7 years on the trot of fuel duty for motorists being frozen. And if they can find the money to freeze fuel duty for motorists, I think they could find the money to move over to CPI. It's really staggering how the government is treating motorists differently from rail passengers. It's completely unfair, and they need to remember that rail passengers have the vote too.
Stephen, so completely unfair, but some suggestions from Labour opposition is that people who don't commute via rail, in other words, other taxpayers, should subsidise people who do use the trains. That's fair, I suppose some might suggest, especially if people who are motorists are being subsidised.
That is the current system. So at the moment, the passengers are paying for this, and they're paying the way. Jeremy Corbyn and Labour want the rail system to be nationalised. That's their vision, and that's what their big argument is today. Tory MPs are really worried about that. They think it struck a chord during the snap election, and they think that if rail fares continue to rise and you've got poor levels of service, it's kind of building up Jeremy Corbyn's argument and Labour's argument on nationalisation, which is something that the Tories are very much ideologically opposed to and would be very, very difficult for them.
Bruce, is there not an argument, though, that there wasn't sufficient investment during nationalisation previously, which is why we found ourselves in the position that we're in now?
It's certainly true that for decades the railways were starved of investment, and the investment that is happening now is very welcome, but we've got a huge backlog to clear up, and this investment has to be paid for, one way or another. But hopefully at some point in the future the investment will pay off and we'll have a better railway service. But like I said, we've got an awful lot of catching up to do, and there's going to be no magic improvements overnight, I think.
Yeah, I suppose the argument must be, though, Stephen, eventually that reinvestment will plateau, and would that then be passed on, those savings, because you don't have to invest anymore, be passed on to rail commuters?
You would hope so, but there is another backdrop to this, which is a significant problem in that passenger numbers are actually stalling. They were predicted to go up year on year and to rise, inevitably keep going up. And that just isn't happening. And some of the franchises are now in real significant problems. We've just seen that on the East Coast Main Line. So there is a financial problem for the train companies themselves in that rail travel is less popular than was expected and was forecast.
Yeah, Bruce, people are not using the railways as much, so why should we subsidise them?
Well, because of the practicality of running a nation, an industrialised nation, where railways are an integral part of that and contribute hugely to the economy. It could be argued as well that motorists don't pay the full whack. They don't pay the externalities of the consequences of having a road network. But I agree that rail numbers seem to be levelling off, and the warnings that we and others have given that the government are pricing people off the railways seems to be actually coming true now. And the consequence of that, of course, is that you're driving people onto our ever more congested roads, increasing pollution.
Stephen, it doesn't help that we see companies like Stagecoach and Virgin Trains in the form of the East Coast Main Line being bailed out at great expense by this government.
Exactly, and people are saying to me, even Tory MPs are saying to me, this gives privatisation a bad name. The government denies that this is a bailout, but nonetheless there is a significant sum of money which this train company had committed to paying in the run-up to 2023, which is now not going to pay because the contract has been effectively cut short. And Tory MPs are really worried about this. They again think this is giving more succour to Jeremy Corbyn and to Labour, and it's again they see it as a real problem which they think Theresa May needs to grip.
Bruce, how do other European countries like Germany manage to keep their rail fares down to less than a fifth of what we pay here in the United Kingdom?
Well, I think there's two reasons. Firstly, they are subsidised. The German taxpayer probably does contribute more than the British taxpayer does on a sort of per mile or per route basis. But of course, privatisation is another factor as well. Whilst the train operating companies themselves are fairly efficient and they run a fairly tight ship, the whole nature of the privatised system, with so many hundreds of not just the train operating companies, but contractors and subcontractors and so on, adds a huge bureaucratic load to British Railways, which I think adds to its costs.
Stephen, so when it comes down to it, it's either more subsidies or renationalisation in order to be able to have a better rail service?
That is the current state of the political debate. You've got the Tories that are subsidising a privately run system, which Tory MPs are concerning is not functioning enough, and you've got Jeremy Corbyn on the other side calling for renationalisation. The Tories are concerned that people have forgotten what they describe as the lessons of the 1970s of British rail, that nationalisation isn't all that it's said to be, and that a younger generation is actually being won over by Jeremy Corbyn's arguments.
Or presumably, Bruce, there could be a third way, as some famous politician once coined that phrase, by building more homes near to where the jobs are.
Well, clearly there is a housing shortage, and it makes sense to build houses where jobs are. But people are naturally inclined to do that anyway, because either by rail or by car, travel is expensive. But I just think that the reality of Britain as it is today, the need for commuting transport certainly isn't going to go away. And this issue isn't going to go away either for that reason.
Final thoughts, Stephen, before we let you go. Some people watching this afternoon might say people who commute are better paid and better well off than the average. So, poof, we're not subsidising them.
I think that's unfair. A lot of people that commute are genuinely lower paid workers. I've spoken to several Tory MPs who've made that point, that these are low paid workers. They're being hit hard and they're really struggling. And one thing that's angering people today is that the government is conspicuous in its absence in responding to this. Chris Grayling is currently in Qatar on a work trip. He's not actually on the cameras talking about this, and people want answers and they don't seem to be getting them today.
Yeah, Chris Grayling might be hiding for other reasons, as we well know. It's good to talk to both of you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. So if you are watching, Mr. Grayling, I know that people watch us right around the world. You want to come and talk to us? Want to talk to us about that East Coast Main Line, how much it's cost, whether you're going to keep your job as a result? Love to talk to you at any stage. Lord Adonis thinks that you won't. What do you think?
There's misery for commuters today after the biggest fare increases for 5 years came into force. Campaigners say many people are being priced out of getting to work, and Labour says it will make more people consider travelling by car. Sky's Tom Parmenter reports.
Lots to think about. The biggest rail ticket increases for 5 years, up on average 3.4%. And it's cold, it's wet and miserable outside. As we travelled into Birmingham New Street, we even found a sympathetic Network Rail engineer.
Do you understand people's frustration?
Completely, yes, yeah. yes. The hike of the fare is going up. That is actually more than what people earn. It's something that's very difficult for anyone to stomach.
A Sky Data poll has found that 73% of people say the new price hike is unfair. Support for renationalisation of the railways is strong. 60% support it, 20% oppose it, and a further 20% were undecided. The unions, the Labour Party and others believe there has to be another way.
We need to have a better system than this, that's absolutely for sure. And I think we've presented that case to the British public and it appeals to them. And I think it's proving incredibly popular, and that's why it'll be a flagship policy going to the next election.
London Bridge is the latest revamped station, the kind of massive investment that the train operators and the government say represents value and progress for rail users.
No, we don't set the fares, but we do spend about 50% of the money that's spent on the railway, and our job is to make sure that that money is spent as efficiently as possible. I know how passengers feel, and they do rightly feel frustrated sometimes about the quality of the service. But that's why we're making this huge investment.
Passengers across the UK just want to be able to see that investment on their section of track.
It's fine if you can pick and mix your times and find those real bargains that do exist online for pre-booked tickets, but if you're an everyday user of the trains, it is you, once again, who's being hit.
Some will think about getting off and driving. Most will pay through gritted teeth.
A lot of delays, a lot of cancellations, so I think they have to improve in that. That's what I think.
Can they do that while they're still private companies, or would you like to see renationalisation?
Renationalisation, yeah.
And I would love it to come back.
Really?
Yeah, of course. But it's not going to happen, is it?
I think, it's better to try and change something than to sit and stagnate.
2018 marks 25 years since British Rail was broken up. Going back isn't an option, but the idea of changing trains is appealing when you can't afford what's currently on offer. Tom Parmenter, Sky News, Birmingham.
Let's get more now on our top story on rail ticket price hikes as the biggest fare increase in 5 years comes into force. Every year the government puts up the cost, there's outrage and it turns into a PR disaster. Can the government actually do more to restrict or cap the prices? Well, we're joined by Matt Dykes, Senior Policy Officer for Public Services at Action for Rail. What do you think, Mr Dykes? What can the government do to reduce this issue?
Well, I think it should be acknowledged that UK rail passengers are facing a particularly significant hike in rail fares this year, and it's coming on the back of an unprecedented decade of wage squeezes, which is really putting additional pressure on household budgets, which is really beginning to hurt. And I think what UK rail commuters are going to be particularly concerned about is just how much more they're paying for their rail fares than European counterparts. And our research shows that average UK rail commuters are spending almost 5 times as much as commuters in places like Spain and France and Germany. So we think there's a lot that can be learned from our other European countries and how they handle their rail industries.
So how should the government be funding this infrastructure work on the railways if it's not funded by fare hikes?
Well, the government does already provide significant investment. It's not coming from the train operating companies, that's for sure. It largely comes through Network Rail borrowing and direct investment from the government. But the UK spends far less than the OECD average on infrastructure. So we think the government should be putting more money into key infrastructure that provides a range of benefits in the wider economy in terms of productivity and also for our environment. So we think, yes, the government should be subsidising and investing more in rail. But I think it also has to tackle the structure of the rail industry. I think there's a lot of cost inefficiencies that arise from the privatised rail industry that we have. It's fragmented, it has all sort of transaction costs, interfaces from different train operating companies and Network Rail. If we were to bring that into the kind of unified, integrated and publicly owned structure that we see in Europe, significant savings could be made that would enable the government to either fund fare freezes or even fare cuts.
Now, do you think this fare hike will result in people looking to other modes of transport?
Well, I think unfortunately not, no, because I think what the government have realised by transferring year-on-year additional costs onto commuters is it knows it's got a captive market. People tend to use trains because they are quicker, cleaner, better way of getting to work and covering the kind of distances that people were more and more, because they're being priced out of the centre of London, people are more and more having to cover bigger distances to work. So the train is always going to be the first option. The government know they've got a captive market and they're asking rail commuters to shoulder that burden.
Now, of course, we've seen protests up and down the country at stations today. Just how much impact and success do you think protests like that will have?
Well, I think protests give a strong message to the government that something needs to happen. We need short-term action. We need a rail freeze next year, at the very least. But we also need increased subsidies, as we said, increased investment in infrastructure. And we need to tackle the structure of the rail industry. That message is getting over to the government now. But we'll also see that message getting over in the ballot box in time if this situation continues.
OK, Matt Dykes, Senior Policy Officer for Public Services at Action for Rail, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Cheers.
The biggest hike in train fares for 5 years. That's what commuters faced this morning as they returned to work after the Christmas break. The average price for tickets rose by 3.4% today, with some commuters spending as much as £5,000 on a season ticket. The rail industry says the changes will mean a better service and investment for the future. But unions say commuters are being priced out as the burden of paying for the rail system falls increasingly on passengers. Our transport correspondent Richard Westcott has the story. His report contains flashing images.
It's one of the most reliable things on the railway. Every January, without fail, the fares go up. This year's rise is especially steep, the highest in 5 years. This is the busy commuter line, people coming in from Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire into London. And plenty of people on this train are just a few pounds shy of the £5,000 club. £5,000 for an annual season ticket. That's gone up by about £600 in the last 5 years. So the price rises have been relentless.
Other countries in Europe don't pay anywhere near as much as we do, and their services tend to be better than ours.
I could be earning something, like taking home more of my salary if I was working back in Hertfordshire. But obviously, like most job opportunities, especially for like young people and young graduates, are down in London.
Average fares across Britain go up by 3.4%. Season tickets, which are regulated by the government, go up by 3.6%. It adds more than £140 to a ticket between Crewe and Preston. If you commute into London from Swindon, it's now £300 more expensive. And the Glasgow-Edinburgh commute goes up by £136. Different parts of the country, but most people have similar gripes.
It's pretty disgusting. You're not even guaranteed a seat, so I think it's wrong.
I travel around Cardiff quite a lot using the train, find that quite convenient, and I find it quite affordable to do that, and it compares quite well with the bus, and it compares quite well with driving.
Better service, please. More trains, and there'll be more people, wouldn't there? They'll get people off the roads then.
This is where a lot of the money's going. London Bridge has just had £1 billion makeover. And there's a whole new line coming under London, Crossrail. The government says it's investing record amounts to improve the trains, but it's also changing who foots the bill. A smaller proportion now comes from the taxpayer, which means more has to come from ticket sales.
Well, for every £1 that a passenger pays in fares, 97p goes directly into running and improving the railway. But also with more people using the railway, that means we have more money to invest.
Campaigners argue some people are being priced off the railways. This graph shows what's been happening to rail fares in recent years. And here's what's been happening to the average pay packet. You can see fares have often been outstripping wages. Labour want to renationalise the railways.
If we can continue to make savings by bringing the railways back into public ownership, stop wasting money on franchising, stop wasting money on the complexity of the arrangements between all these different companies, and we don't pay out dividends to state-owned companies across the channel, Nederlandse Spoorwegen and Deutsche Bahn, who are here as Abellio and as Arriva, we can keep that money in-house.
As many of our trains get busier, the annual fare rise looks set to stay. Well, it's such a controversial subject. There have been some political developments on this today. Labour have accused the Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, of hiding away. He's been on an official visit to Qatar, and he's responded to that and said he hasn't been hiding away at all. These figures were first out in the summer, and he's already talked about them, so I'm sure that will develop as the days go on. I said in my report there, this government and consecutive governments actually have changed who pays for the railways. A much bigger proportion now comes from the people who use the trains. And what does that mean? That means that we are likely to be having exactly the same conversation on the 2nd of January next year.
Richard, thank you.
New year, new rail fare increases. It's become an unwelcome part of the festive season. Many rail passengers are being hit with the highest ticket price rise in 5 years. The Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, who's in Qatar, admitted the increase was higher than he would wish, while many commuters and the rail union claim services aren't improving despite the higher costs. But rail companies insist the extra revenue will boost investment in the network, as Paul McNamara reports.
It's the first day back at the office for many. Not everyone seems that excited about it. Maybe that's the post-holiday blues. Or maybe it's the 3.5% more many commuters will have to pay for their rail fares as of today.
Train fares have just gone up 3.5%. How do you feel about it?
Not happy about it at all. No, it's like even today, it's like first day of New Year and the train's stuck on the tracks for another 10 minutes, you know what I mean? Like nothing's changing, but the price is going up.
Do you think it's worth the money, and do you think it's worth paying extra for?
No. But I have to get to work. What do you do?
I haven't got a choice. I can't move closer, I can't drive, so that's a pain.
Do you think you're getting the service that you deserve?
No, I think the service is good, but it's too expensive. Can't afford it.
It's gone up from $4.40 to $4.50. That's not too bad.
Many, though, are facing far heftier price hikes, and it's affecting people across the nation. An annual season ticket from Oxford to London is now over £5,000, up by £176. Liverpool to Manchester is £108 more expensive, while Tweebank into Edinburgh is up by £96. And it's not just season tickets. An off-peak fare from Slough to London, for example, is up by nearly 10%. How were these increases met? With protest in Newcastle, Cardiff, London and dozens of other towns and cities across the nation. The unions say fare rises have far outstripped wage increases since the Conservatives came to power. Their answer? Nationalisation.
Privatisation is expensive. If we renationalise the rail industry, you could save up to £1 billion a year by getting rid of all the fragmentation and all the profiteering that goes on. And that money could be better spent either on reinvesting into the rail network, new trains, or actually keeping fares low or cutting fares.
Network Rail say these fares go towards modernising the infrastructure and improving services.
And as if to prove the point, today they fully opened London Bridge Station after 5 years of development.
So this all looks pretty swish. Well, for £1 billion of investment, it probably should do. But for many commuters who spend as much as 13% of their salary on train fares, the state of stations isn't the problem. Cramped, delayed trains that they can't get a seat on is. And for all the price hikes, including today's, the service doesn't appear to be getting much better. But many consumers are seeing the prices go up and up and up. They're not seeing that reflected in the service that they're getting.
Well, we are seeing it. We are seeing it today in this station, and it's an example of what is being done. And over the next 18 months, we're going to see an unprecedented series of improvements, which have been in the pipeline for a while, but now they're being delivered.
It's the government that ultimately set today's price hikes, the largest in 5 years, and announced it months ago. The Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, though, decided now was the time for a trade trip to Qatar. Inevitable criticism ensued. He took to radio when he landed this afternoon.
I don't think I've shirked the issue, but I think it's really important that we get out and try and win business for Britain. Today, my presence in the country doesn't make any difference. I can make a difference, try to help Britain get more jobs.
Mr Grayling also said he can't promise prices won't rise again next year. Possibly something then commuters can guarantee arriving on time without delay.
Paul McNamara reporting.
Well, back here now, it is a universal truth of modern politics that transport is just about the Cabinet's least glamorous job. Important? Yep, maybe. But since it is rarely in the news, not generally considered one for the Cabinet's rising stars. But for those of us who stood on a cold or wet station platform this morning on the first working day of 2018, just saying, waiting for an overcrowded or late train whilst contemplating the joys of another whopping price rise, this was surely a moment to hear from whoever is our Transport Secretary. Sadly, Chris Grayling, yep, that is him, was in sunny Qatar on business, which, with a cabinet reshuffle in the offing, doesn't feel like the world's smartest career move.
Tonight, passengers complained of delays, overcrowding, broken toilets and overflowing luggage on the Edinburgh to London line. Just one example of why, on the day fares went up, passengers across the country were infuriated. At dawn in Cardiff, new prices came with the same old problems.
Very frustrating because we're always packed in like sardines in the morning.
In Sheffield, Fears Rail is now unaffordable.
I see people all the time that can't afford a weekly train ticket to get to work.
In Brighton, some of the biggest season ticket price rises of all.
It's going to be harder for me because it's considerable amount of my wages go on my season pass, so it means things will be tighter.
Across the UK, fares rose today on average 3.4%. New research for ITV News shows a 20-mile commute in the UK, which now costs £3,249, will be £735 in France for the same distance and £729 in Spain.
For passengers, the New Year greeting is grim. You'll have to pay more. And because these fare rises are far in excess of the average increase in salaries, it's led to new concerns that people are quite simply being priced off the tracks.
Campaigning against today's rail fare rises.
Protesting at 40 stations, unions and passenger groups said commuters now often spend 13% of salary simply getting to work.
We know that there's hundreds of millions of pounds being given to the private operators in profits that these fare rises have helped subsidise.
The most recent official passenger survey shows more than half are already dissatisfied with prices. Today, one of the most influential figures in this industry, heading Network Rail, told me he too thinks prices should be lower.
Do you honestly think this is still an affordable service?
Obviously, I recognise that people are not happy with the fare increases, and I share the desire to reduce the costs of travelling by train.
How can your industry justify asking even more for fares when basics like overcrowding and unnecessary disruption still have not been tackled?
Over the last 3 years, we've had a huge programme of investment, and during that investment there has been disruption. It's almost inevitable.
The rail industry promises record-breaking improvements this year, but when it comes to value for money, many passengers still don't believe we've reached the long-promised destination. Chris Choi, News at 10.
Well, as you will have noted, one person conspicuously absent from that report and in indeed today's coverage more generally, has been the Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling. For the reasons we outlined, Angus is here to talk about it. Let's face it, rail price rises at the start of January are not the greatest surprise in the political calendar. It feels, I mean, mucking about aside, it feels genuinely a bit odd that he wasn't here today.
Well, that's right. I mean, Christmas decorations start to come down, rail fares go up. It's not a story that sneaks up on ministers. So it did seem, arguably, odd. There were no transport ministers at all available to speak on radio or television this morning to publicly explain why fares were going up by this huge chunk, the largest rise in 5 years. A media strategy, perhaps. It went wrong if it did, because later on, Chris Grayling was suddenly available to speak via his mobile phone from Qatar, where he's on a business trip, saying he had to do this trip outside of parliamentary time. He said he understood passenger frustrations to me. He said he's moving as fast as he can to try to link rail fares to the lower measure inflation. He says that's very difficult to do, but he's trying to do it. And he pointed out, emphasised, that we are seeing the greatest investment in railways in living memory, as he put it. And he makes no apologies, he said, for going to Qatar to try to boost British businesses.
OK, we all know, being fair, that rail is a very, very expensive business. If he was here, if he had been here today, what do you think would have been his general case?
Well, I think they are making the case, that the government is making the case. There is a lot of investment. Look at London Bridge Station, reopened today, revamped, billions of pounds spent. They also like to make the point that 97 pence of every pound in fares is reinvested in the railways. Look at the new station in Birmingham, perhaps. Also, lots more services, longer trains, newer trains, all being promised. And the money has to come from somewhere. But I think stories like today play very quickly into the broader political economic battlefield, which is that people are getting much lower wage increases than inflation is much higher. So lots of working people finding it very hard to make ends meet. And that is a broader political battle which will continue.
OK, thank you very much indeed.